If you've been around the channel for a while, by now you know what the smoke pit is. It's a place where guys and gals will swap stories. This episode is comprised of several stories from your fellow channel subscribers about their encounters with black, triangular-shaped, for want of a better word, aircraft. Aircraft that these individuals mostly all say was flying low to the ground at slow speeds or hovering, and then disappearing or rocketing off at high speeds. Some of these people are military service members. Others are people who live in close proximity to the military bases where these craft are presumed to have been launched from. In some respects, this TR-3 Bravo aircraft, and I'm not even sure if I'm pronouncing it correctly, TR-3 Bravo, is widely considered to be a known technology with incredible flight capabilities and is essentially a reverse-engineered UFO, although officially, it doesn't exist. And if it does, like any other classified military project or weapon, there are probably many good reasons why its existence isn't public knowledge. But clearly, there are many reports of people sighting these things, even in broad daylight. So, it's not as if it's really any great secret. I've got a pile of at least 20 stories about these, so one measly episode won't be enough to cover all of them, but I will try to organize them as best I can. I hope those who have shared their stories don't mind, but because many of these stories were shared either in a YouTube comment or in some short format, I've also taken the liberty of adding some punctuation, moving some stuff around, adding or changing a few words here and there to clarify where and when the story took place, or otherwise by removing any information that was given that wasn't necessary to the overall story. With that, let's get to the stories. The following account was provided by one of your fellow viewers who goes by the username JDLambo6926. I'm 39 years old. I grew up in Arkansas, maybe an hour's drive from the Jacksonville Air Force Base. When I was 18, me and a childhood friend were headed home one day from a baseball game, driving down an old country road. Out of nowhere, a triangle-shaped object about the size of a school bus drifted slowly over the middle of the road ahead of us. It passed right over the tops of the trees that line the road. When it reached the middle of the road, it stopped, and then it just went in reverse, right back across the road, and disappeared back behind the cover of the trees, and we couldn't see it anymore. We weren't super excited or anything, but just as soon as it was gone, I remember saying, "Did you see that?" And Chris, my buddy, said, "Yeah, I did. That was wild." Now, over 20 years later, me and Chris both work at the VA hospital, and every now and then we will cross paths at work, and that is the first thing we will remind each other of, the time that we saw this craft. This was before drones, at least commercially speaking to my knowledge. And anytime someone tells me about seeing a round-shaped UFO, I am always a little bit skeptical, but when someone says that they've seen a triangular one, I think, maybe. We both thought it might be a stealth bomber, but I've never heard of one that could fly that slow and then just reverse. Again, we do have the Jacksonville Air Force Base nearby, but we were still maybe 60 miles from there, and this thing was not traveling any faster than we were, driving down that country road at maybe 40 miles an hour. Part of my conviction in believing the stories contained in this episode, because like I said, there's 20, overall that I have so far, is that most people who shared them never really seemed to make an effort to provide more information about the craft beyond what they saw with their own two eyes, like this gentleman, and I certainly appreciate what seems to be a humble honesty. For instance, as JD Lambo mentioned about reasoning whether or not the craft could have been flown from an Air Force base 60 miles away, and he thought maybe not because of how slowly he saw the craft moving. You'll notice in the following accounts that although often seen traveling at slower speeds like he described, The aircraft clearly has the ability to fly at extremely high speeds, in 3 dimensions. But since he didn't see the craft pulling these fast maneuvers, and he lost sight of it behind the trees, he could only reason with the limited information that he had, and that the craft could only fly very slowly. I mention this because some people who discuss this aircraft, call it an aircraft, online, they do portray themselves as knowledgeable, citing various technological aspects of the craft with seeming indifference. They talk confidently about anti-gravity engines and pressurized mercury and nuclear plasma energy devices which produce the anti-gravity fields around the ship, as if all this could be read in any high school textbook. That jargon is all Greek to me. I'm a simple guy, and I expect that maybe it's more of a combined knowledge, an amalgamation of different UFO studies that these people have done and bits of leaked information, if anything. And maybe they do know what they're talking about. I'm not going to sit here and say that they don't, because I don't know that for certain. But I kind of get the impression that people who speak knowledgeably about it, unless they are people who have worked on these crafts and they are 100% certain of their knowledge about it because of their involvement, and perhaps they are potentially violating their security clearances by discussing this information openly, people will, there wasn't there a guy who went on Discord and he was giving away government secrets for clout? There are people like that, so it's not entirely impossible. But as the witnesses in this episode and the other stories I have compiled indicate, this aircraft was something entirely unknown to them, and it was not something they ever expected to see flying across the sky. So it's not as if these things are just common knowledge to the whole population. This next account was provided by another one of your fellow viewers, who goes by the username Estern001. I was in the Navy from 1986 to 1998. This event happened on March 31st, 1997. I remember it because it was also the night before we set sail on Westpac, which is a 6-month deployment where we float around the Western Pacific region. Anyway, our ship, the USS Constellation, was docked in San Diego. My girlfriend and I were spending my last night ashore, visiting family up in Palm Springs. So we leave Palm Springs around midnight, heading back to San Diego. It was a clear night, and there was almost no traffic on the highway. Since most of this highway stretches across open desert, the sky out there is super clear, and you can see a lot of stars. And side note here, I've driven between California and Arizona many times. You pass by Palm Springs. He's absolutely right. It's very clear. I'm like looking out the window at the stars. Anyway, somewhere between cities, we suddenly noticed these lights in the sky. They were white lights in a triangular pattern, and they were attached to a triangular-shaped craft. The craft was dark in color and not really visible. We could only see the outline of it because as it moved across the sky, it was clearly blocking the stars that were behind it. So I pull over, and we get out of the car, and we stand there watching it for about 10 to 15 minutes. It was massive, and was just drifting slowly and silently across the sky. Look, I was an aircraft mechanic in the Navy. I had worked on the flight deck at night for many deployments at that time. I know what aircraft look like and sound like in the night sky. This was an unidentified flying object like nothing I have ever seen in the military or otherwise. Considering his travel route from Palm Springs to San Diego, the nearest U.S. Air Force base that this craft might have been launched from, somewhere in the in-between, would be the March Air Reserve Base in Riverside County, which he would have driven past. And considering he said that the craft was massive, and other accounts that you'll hear talk about how the craft is often seen flying very low to the ground, in some cases less than 50 feet, I get the sense that there is a sort of visual phenomenon, especially at night, that happens when seeing this craft overhead. Because it is completely silent, and there is that bizarre absence of sound to deal with. And while viewers are looking up at it in the night sky without any reference, they might not realize how close it is, and that's why he thought it was massive. The ship is described as really only being as long as a school bus, like the previous account, which isn't massive, but it could seem to be larger, right, if the witness thinks that it's flying much higher above them than it really is. It's the same phenomenon, I expect, or maybe a reversal of this phenomenon, that when you look at the moon while it's coming up over the horizon, it looks massive when there's mountains and trees and buildings to compare it to, but once it rises up overhead and there are no visual references to compare it with, it just looks smaller in the open sky. This third account was provided by another one of your fellow viewers named Gavin, who most recently goes by the username PVPenne. Not sure if I pronounced that correctly. His sighting took place further north, in California, but this time near the coastline, at least 250 to 300 miles to the northwest from the sighting near Palm Springs. I live in the city of San Luis Obispo, just south of Camp Roberts. About a year ago, which would be 2021 since he posted this comment 11 months ago, I was out trying to catch a glimpse of a meteor shower when a black triangle with dim amber and red lights flew right above my head. It was dead silent and really slow for something flying. This thing, however, wasn't headed towards the military base, but was on a direct path to the nuclear power station at Diablo Canyon, which is only a few miles to the west of me on the shoreline. The military base Gavin mentioned, Camp Roberts, is an active California National Guard post. It does have a rather shabby-looking runway, but not a single hangar bay or other aircraft to speak of in the satellite imagery. 30 miles to the south is another U.S. Army base named Camp San Luis Obispo, which, although not as active now as it was during the war years from the 1940s to the 70s, like Camp Roberts, it still serves as a military training camp with field and garrison facilities. Neither of these bases, however, seem to be feasible locations for the housing and maintenance of any kind of aircraft. However, there are two Air Force bases within a reasonable proximity of San Luis Obispo: Edwards Air Force Base, 160 miles to the east, and Vandenberg Air Force Base, which is also located near the coastline, only 40 miles to the south. And perhaps it's worth noting that more recently, the Vandenberg Air Force Base has been renamed to the Vandenberg Space Force Base, and is home to the Combined Force Space Component Command. This unit's mission statement is to plan, integrate, conduct, and assess global space operations in order to deliver combat-relevant space capabilities to combatant commanders, coalition partners, the Joint Force, and the nation. The following account was provided by yet another one of your fellow viewers who goes by the username StacyN2541. I have absolutely seen these, and she was referring to something she saw in an episode which wasn't about the TR-3 Bravo, so not sure what she might have been referring to. Maybe the triangular formations of lights that people were reporting in that episode. Anyway, I have absolutely seen these. Too Long Didn't Read version, I saw a military stealth aircraft fly over my house, very low, completely silent, and in the daytime. Well, Stacy, we're going to read the long version. She says, I live about 30 minutes north of Crane Naval Base in central Indiana. I have lived between several military bases most of my life and have seen and heard probably thousands of military aircraft flying by. This was maybe 2010? I saw something I have never seen before. I was in my backyard, in the daytime. It was a cloudy day, pretty sure the kids were in school because I was alone, and I noticed a shadow moving along the ground from something overhead very slowly. So I looked up, and moving north was a gray, black, almost completely triangular military craft. It was not black, it was not gray, it was darker than gray, like smoke. I just stood there for nearly 15 seconds in shock, watching as this thing glided silently over my house. It was so low, I actually worried it would graze the roof. It was at least the width of my house. As far as its size, from wingtip to wingtip, this thing was at least the size of the side of my house in length. Not the back of my house, the longer portion of my house, but the side of my house. So maybe 26 feet from wingtip to wingtip. And I have Googled stealth jets, and it definitely matches some of the pictures. I just cannot get over the fact that this was absolutely silent, and it was so low, I felt like I could have reached up and touched it. And it also, as far as what was keeping it off the ground, it didn't change the temperature on the ground. It flew right over me. If anything, it felt cooler underneath it. But why was it flying so low? My house was on the outer edge of town and on the edge of my suburb. This thing was flying into and over a very large town. But once it passed the house, I couldn't see it anymore because the house was now blocking my view. And it took me less than a minute to get over my shock so I could run into the house and, out the front door and see it again. But it was gone. There was no exhaust blowback, zero engine noise, and no identity markings. I could be wrong about the year, but it was at least between 2003 and 2012. I have never shared this story before because I felt like whatever it was, it had to be top secret. Fantastic as her story is, in correlation with all these other stories from viewers, this story from Stacy compares well to much of what others have described seeing and seems much more believable in that context, but that's just me. It's like what J.D. Lambo said in his account. Even he has a hard time believing if someone said they saw a circular UFO because he hasn't seen one himself. But if someone shared a story about a slow-flying, silent, black, triangular craft seen hovering low over the ground, it's much easier to believe for him because he's seen something like it. Seeing is clearly believing. The rest of us are apparently just missing out on seeing all this cool stuff. Taking a look at the Crane Naval Base, otherwise called Naval Surface Warfare Center Crane, there doesn't appear to be much by way of aircraft facilities or anything that would indicate the base can host the arrival or departure of at least fixed-wing aircraft. The base does have a Prowler aircraft on static display in one of their parking lots, but looking at the ceremonial photos when that aircraft arrived and was decommissioned, the plane was clearly trucked onto the base because it said it landed at the Monroe County Airport in Bloomington, which is about 35 miles away. Nothing to say a craft that can land and take off vertically couldn't have been housed at the base, though. This next account was provided by another one of your fellow viewers who goes by the username JimMochi7317. I've had a similar experience with a UFO or a craft following my family while driving, but it was a dark gray, blackish, metallic, triangle-shaped object with 3 holes underneath each corner, which I assumed were for lights, but they were off. It somehow looked like the craft was morphing, but now that I think about it, it could have just been the haze surrounding it because it never changed shape. It just appeared like it was. I can't really explain it. We were at a stoplight when the craft passed over the car. It was a Chevy Impala, and it was bigger than our car, but not huge. and it was very low. So low that if a tall person were to stand on the car, they would probably be able to reach up and touch it. It was hovering, rotating, and gliding forward at the same time, and the corners of the triangle were more rounded. It passed over from the right, and by the time it got to the left side of the car, we had just turned right into a gas station. I turned back to see where it was going, but it was gone. And there's no way it could have flown out of sight that fast. This thing was going so slowly that I could have walked faster than it was moving. I even looked around at other people at the gas station to see if they were looking up, but no one else seemed to have noticed it. This was around 9 or 10 p.m. at night. This individual, Jim, might have some companionship with Stacy, because he too said he could have practically touched it. It was flying so low. And that by the time he tried to see it again, it had disappeared without a sound. The following account was provided by, you guessed it, yet another one of your fellow viewers, who goes by the username, the Resident Teacher 2438. And he doesn't waste any time. He gets right to the point. TR3 Bravo. One has flown over my head about 1,000 feet. I could have hit it with a rock. Guessing he's just... I don't know anybody that can throw a rock 1,000 feet in the air, but we know what he means. It's flying pretty low. Ironically, I was reading Jim Marr's Alien Agenda and had went outside for a drink. For some reason, something told me to bring my phone, and of course, I didn't. What could happen, right? Well, I was outside thinking to myself, when am I going to see something? Then I look off to the right and watch as a ball of light closes a large distance in 5 seconds. This thing slows down and then it flies over me, silent as hell. And it was a big-ass black triangle, but it had blue and red tracking lights at the rear. In the center, on the bottom, was what must have been the gravity drive, which looked like a circular half globe protruding from the base. It was like looking into a sea of black, shimmering silk. Again, silent as hell. By the way, I live in Indianapolis, and the nearest base is Wright-Patterson. If you know that place, well, you've probably heard some of the rumors of the kinds of toys that they keep stored there. Now, the first thing is the distance that he said, 1,000 feet in the air. I'm trying to imagine it myself. It's not that high, but for him to describe it in such detail, maybe it was a little bit lower like the others have described, maybe 1,000 feet was or was not a correct estimate. But anyway, as he mentioned, Wright-Patterson Air Force Base is located near the Indiana-Ohio border in the state of Ohio. And considering he too lives in Indiana, only about 60 miles away from Stacy's home, maybe that base is where we might reason the craft that Stacy saw also originated from, rather than the Naval Surface Warfare Center, Crane Naval Base. Although I'm not sure what, if any, correlation it might have, it's interesting that the base, Wright-Patterson, which was formerly known as Wright Field, was indirectly involved with well-documented military sightings of UFOs in the 1940s, which took place the same day as the Mantell UFO incident in Kentucky, January 7, 1948. And as cited by Richard Haynes in his book, Advanced Aerial Devices Reported During the Korean War, it's probably no coincidence that only 2 weeks later, on January 22, 1948, Project Sign, also known as Project Saucer, was initially established at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base.